So today I'm going to be talking about Liquidity and LUSD, a stablecoin. Who here has heard of Liquidity or LUSD? Could you raise your hands? A few here and there, not too many, but okay. So hopefully today's presentation will help you understand what Liquidity is, what LUSD is, and also to consider decentralized stablecoins. Cool. So Liquidity in numbers. So we have been around for over 2.5 years. We have issued over $5 billion in loans and have 33 million in revenue generated so far. And current TVL of our protocol is currently 600 million US dollars. Let me see. I don't know. Oh, there you go. Cool. And what we allow you to do is we allow you to borrow against your Ether. So you can deposit your Ether within our protocol. You get something called LUSD, which is a stable coin. And you can essentially borrow that interest-free with a one-time borrow fee of 0.5%. In terms of how big we are, we have the third most Ether in DeFi after MakerDAO and Aave. And in terms of the TVL, we're number 13. In terms of LUSD, the stablecoin, we're number 10 by market cap. So after DAI and Frax, we're the third biggest decentralized stablecoin. Cool. So there are three main use cases when you use Liquidity. One is borrow against your ETH. So deposit your ETH, borrow LUSD, interest-free. So if you're borrowing for a long period of time, we're very cheap compared to the competition. You can also leverage up on your ETH. So if you want to buy your deposit your ETH, sell your LUSD for more ETH, you can do that as well. And you can also diversify your stablecoin holdings by getting a stablecoin that is only backed by Ether. No centralized risk whatsoever. Completely trustless. Right? So just to talk a little bit more on that. Let me just move to one of the cool things about Liquidity as well is that, as I mentioned earlier, we provide interest-free borrowing. This is a bit too quick. 1 second. Oh, wow. Cool. So the reasons why Liquidity is quite unique is that we don't charge any interest when you borrow against your Ether. We are also very capital efficient. So if you're borrowing against your Ether compared to the competition, we allow you to borrow up to 91% of your loan to value, which is quite high compared to competitors in the space. Maker, for example, allows you to borrow at up to 75%. Same goes with Aave. And one of the coolest things, in my opinion, is that Liquidity is non-upgradable. So it's immutable. So we cannot make any changes to the protocol whatsoever. What you see is what you get. We have no governance, no admin control, and it's completely decentralized. So you might be wondering, so how are people using Liquidity in LATAM, for example? And we have a very good use case of a fellow crypto Twitter community member. His name is Marcus. Let me just change the slide real quick. There you go. So Marcus lives in Guatemala. He's quite famous within the Latin American crypto Twitter community. And he wanted to borrow against his Ether in order to buy a car. So he went to a bank in Guatemala. He was trying to see if he could get a loan. Loan interest rates in Guatemala were over 20% to borrow. So he was deciding, okay, what protocol should I use in DeFi to maybe get this loan instead? So he was considering Liquidity and MakerDAO, two of the leading protocols in DeFi. And he pretty much did kind of like a cost comparison between the two. And when he did that, he realized that if he were to use Liquidity, it would be quite a lot cheaper than if he were to use MakerDAO. So right here, you'll see in Spanish a step-by-step blog post that he did of how he was able to borrow against his Ether using Liquidity. And there's also a video on YouTube about this. We can share that later to the Ethereum Mexico community. But here's a step-by-step thing of what he did. So essentially, he opened a loan. He had a loan to value of 250%. He paid 0.5% in interest rates. Then after that, he swapped his LUSD for USDC. That cost him 0.3%. He then took that USDC and off-ramped it using one of the off-ramps that Latam offers. He paid 2% there. And essentially after that, he was able to pretty much buy his car. So the main point here is that all in all, he only spent 2.8% one-time fee to essentially borrow against his Ether. And if you were to compare that compared to some of the competition in the space, in Maker, for example, he would have had to pay 3.25%, and that is an annual interest rate that always gets charged. So for long-term borrowing, you know, it's a great use case to see people using Liquidity to pretty much borrow against their Ether. And in terms of how institutions are using Liquidity, there is a company in Switzerland called Bitcoin Swiss. And essentially in Switzerland, people were like, you know, I want to borrow against my Ether, I want to get somewhere where it's cheap, I want access to euros or dollars or whatever. And Bitcoin Swiss pretty much allowed their users to deposit their Ether with Bitcoin Swiss. And on the backside, they used Liquidity to provide loans to their clients. So it's also pretty much a tool that is being used by both retail users and also institutions as well. So one of the cool things that Liquidity has pioneered in the space is that we are completely decentralized. So we don't even run our front ends. So we have over 20 different front ends that are being run by different community members. So essentially, you can even run a front end yourself. Like Ethereum Mexico can just install a few lines of code and run it like tomorrow if they need to. So that makes us very, very decentralized. Another thing about us, you know, as a team, like we also believe in immutability and having contracts that are non-upgradable. So one of the reasons behind that is because since we only accept Ether as collateral to back LUSD, that also means that you can just go to Etherscan and clearly see, okay, how much LUSD is out there and how much Ether is backing that LUSD. All public, all transparent, you know, completely decentralized as well. And one of the cool things about Liquidity LUSD as well is that our stablecoin is very decentralized, but it's also very stable, which a stablecoin needs to be. So, you know, it's, as you can see, this is essentially the peg over the last year. And it's been pretty much hovering between $1 and $1.03. So with Liquidity, we have something called a soft peg, where it can hover between $1 and $1.10. If it's over $1, people have the incentive to sell that stablecoin. If it's under $1, you can redeem with the protocol as well. So that makes it so that it's essentially a soft peg. So the reason why I'm here today is to talk about stablecoins and what are the different types of stablecoins in the space and why LUSD is something to think about. So I'm sure some of you might have heard of something called the stablecoin trilemma, which is the trilemma between decentralization, scalability, and stability. And Vitalik once said, a stablecoin can only have 2 of the 3 elements. You can't have all 3, you know. That is because if you want decentralization, then you need to sacrifice scalability. And if you want scalability, for example, you need to sacrifice decentralization. So an example is, for example, USDT and USDC, 2 of the most famous stablecoins out there in the space. They both are fiat-backed and they're both centralized because essentially for every USDC or USDT that's out there, Tether and Circle have USD deposits sitting in their bank coffers in Switzerland and in the US. Whereas for something like Liquidity, LUSD, we are very, very much in the decentralized spectrum where, you know, we're non-upgradable, we're censorship resistant, but we also have some drawbacks when it comes to scalability as well. So when we talk about stablecoins, there are mainly 2 types. So there's the CDP-backed stablecoins, which are collateral debt position-backed stablecoins, and fiat or reserve-backed stablecoins. So I'm going to just talk a little bit more about what those 2 are and what the differences there exist between the 2 of them. Cool. So individual positions or CDP-backed stablecoins are, CDP stands for collateral debt positions. So what does that mean? Essentially, to have the stablecoin come into existence, you need to have borrowing demand. So for example, in Liquidity's case, you have to deposit Ether, borrow LUSD. There's always an Ether that's backing it. You always need that consistent borrowing demand. Now, the cool thing about CDP positions is that it's very resilient and that it's very robust even under extreme conditions. But then there's also another type of stablecoin, which is the reserve-backed stablecoins, which are USDC and USDT. And in terms of how these work is essentially they are very scalable because, you know, for every USDC that USDC provides, there's $1 backing it. But the risks here come from the fact that they're very centralized and they run the risk of essentially, I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide, but USDC takes a lot of the reserves that it has, deposits that into different treasury bills, different bank accounts, and essentially this can cause like a bank run, like what happened earlier on this year. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the risks that are posed with that. So with reserve-backed stablecoins, like how do they work? So the graph here gives you a good idea of it. So essentially, you as a user can send USD to a stablecoin issuer. Essentially, that stablecoin then get deposits into a bank. What happens then is that the USD reserves that Circle holds, for example, it gets moved into cash, first of all, to meet short-term liquidity needs, and then the other remainder goes into government bonds, treasury bills, and other yield-bearing assets. And at the end of it, you as a user get USDC or USDT. But one thing to keep in mind is that Circle is taking your USD and kind of getting yield on that, and they're keeping that yield. They're not giving it to the user, you know. So that's how Circle and Tether, USDT, make their money, essentially. So that's how reserve-backed stablecoins work, and obviously there's a lot of risks here in the sense that, you know, it's all centralized, and since they are essentially have quite a few different government bonds and cash-bearing assets, these are put in different places and they also have some risks associated with them. And with protocols like Liquidity and DAI, for example, in our case, it's a bit different where, you know, you have Ethereum essentially or any type of crypto collateral backing that particular stablecoin, and you can clearly see as well, okay, what is backing your stablecoin, what's the supply, everything's clear to see, everything's on chain as well. So you might ask, so what do I need to think about when I choose a stablecoin? Like, do I go for USDC, USDT? Or do I go for LUSD? Do I go for DAI? There are actually quite a few things, but mainly it boils down to counterparty risk. So who is it that's holding the stablecoin? Where are they based? What are they doing with the stablecoin? Where are they getting their yield from? That's one thing. Another is the collateral risk as well. So what is backing that stablecoin? Is it USDC? Is it USDT? Is it Ether? You need to understand that as well. You need to also understand how the peg holds, like what's the stability of the peg, how it's performed. You also need to know the liquidity of the stablecoin. So if you want to get out of that particular stablecoin, how can you get out? How quickly is it? What is the process involved, right? So there was actually a company called Exponential Phi, which did essentially a risk table of how these different stablecoins, the top ones essentially, how they would work. And in that particular report that they did, LUSD came out as best overall, especially because, you know, on the counterparty, collateral, stability, liquidity side, it pretty much got average or great on everything. But if you look here, like the likes of USDC and USDT, they didn't get quite high marks, and that's down to, you know, the collateral that these guys are taking, the counterparty that they're taking. In USDT's case, for example, you know, some of the reserves that they have, you know, it's never been made public. There's still obviously the Tether FUD that goes and comes every few months, pretty much. So these are some things that you need to consider before choosing a stablecoin. And just to touch a little bit more on the collateral types that some of these different stablecoins have. As I mentioned with Liquidity, you have LUSD that is completely backed by ETH. In USDT's case, they have a mixture of treasury bills and some bonds, some gold, some Bitcoin, and they have some others as well that we don't know what it is. In USDC's case, you know, it's a bunch of treasury bills that they have. In DAI's case, actually, and it's quite interesting, we'll touch a little bit more, they have a ton of real-world assets, and they also have a mixture of ETH, USD, staked ETH, wrap BTC, a mixture of a few things. But one thing to keep in mind is that, okay, they have given up on having a lot of the ETH reserves backing their stablecoin, but they have essentially sacrificed that for a little bit of centralization risk by taking on these real-world assets, USDC, USDT, to back their stablecoin. So whereas they're scaling a lot more than, let's say, LUSD, there's also a lot more risk that they're taking on with the collateral that they're taking as well. And the same goes for Frax as well. So just to kind of emphasize a little bit what the risks are of going with multi-collateral and real-world assets. So just to show the collateral that's backing DAI. You can see that over 50% of DAI collateral now is pretty much real-world assets or centralized stablecoin. So, you know, some of the risks that are involved here is that when you take real-world assets as a backing for a stablecoin, sometimes what can happen is that these real-world assets, these custodians, they can default on their loans. So recently there was a case that happened with Centrifuge where although it was a small amount of the circulating collateral that Maker had, they still had essentially a bad debt that they accrued as a result of that. So that's one of the things about taking on real world assets. It's good in the sense that, you know, you're connecting real world with the crypto world, but you're also inherently relying on custodians and also, you know, centralized players who could cause issues down the line. And a result of taking centralized collateral and you know what the risks are is, how many of you here remember the Silvergate Bank issue a couple of months ago, the Silicon Valley Bank issue? So essentially what this table shows here is how many hours it took for some of these stable coins to get back into peg. So you have USDC, obviously, which was quite a lot affected. It took 36 hours. Some other stable coins here as well, like DAI, for example, which also has a lot of centralized collateral backing it, took 40 hours. You had Frax as well, which took like 35 hours to get back to peg. In LUSD's case, we performed quite a lot better than the competition because we don't have any centralized collateral backing our stablecoin. Since it's all ETH, obviously for a little bit it did depeg. That's down to people being irrational and panicking, I guess. But then over time, you know, it quickly came back into peg very, very quickly. So it goes to show, you know, like you do need to think about, when you think about stablecoins and what you hold, diversification is key. And, you know, don't put all your eggs in one basket as UST from Luna shows. Cool. So some of the ways in which some of these decentralized stablecoins are trying to get yield and how they incentivize users to get their stablecoin is by offering yield. So an example of that is with DAI, they have something called SDAI that you guys might have heard of, DAI savings rate. And what they essentially do is by depositing, if a user deposits DAI into the DAI savings rate, they are eligible to get 5% yield. This 5% yield is essentially coming from the different collateral that Maker has that is getting yield, so all the real world assets, and also the surplus of profit that they have within MakerDAO. But one thing to note, so MakerDAO, once they released the DSR and they raised the DAI savings rate to 5%, you could see a clear uptick in the circulating DAI. Like people started buying DAI, people started taking out loans to get that 5% yield. But one thing to think about as well is that they essentially started this program at the end of July, and they started at 8% DAI savings rate. That was what you were going to get yield on, 8%. But within 3 months, essentially 31% of all DAI is sitting within the DAI savings rate, and the yield has come down already to around 5%. And with the 4 more percentage, essentially the yield will drop even further to 4%. So what I'm trying to say here is that short-term incentives, although they work in the short term, in the long run, it's yet to be seen, you know, how sustainable something like this is. It's great for now that the demand that they've gotten, but if they're using protocol revenues and the revenues that MakerDAO is generating to do this, how sustainable really is it? They're essentially paying to acquire customers at the minute, right? And one other thing about MakerDAO is they also have a governance. And as you might all know, MakerDAO's governance is very, very active in both good ways and bad. And what's to say that, you know, with governance, they might just say if it's like 60, 70% of all DAI sitting in DAI savings rate, what's to say that they just say, okay, no, we're going to change the DAI savings rate to something else. So that's also something that you got to think about when building a protocol and when choosing a stablecoin as well, where you get your yield. Now, when you compare that to something like Liquidity and LUSD and how we kind of incentivize people to hold LUSD and stake LUSD, essentially, within Liquidity, there is something called the stability pool where you can stake LUSD. The stability pool essentially is our liquidator within Liquidity. So when there are people who are about to get liquidated, this LUSD that is sitting in the stability pool goes towards paying off underwater positions. So if you are in the stability pool, you essentially get ETH at a discount. And that is the source of the yield, essentially liquidations. And we also have our LQTY token, which is our revenue token, which is essentially, it has a fixed emission schedule, and that also gets streamed to LUSD depositors in the stability pool. My point is that it's fixed. It's all dependent on how the market goes, dependent on how many ETH liquidations happen, and it's pretty much very predictable. And if you look at how the stability pool APR kind of fluctuates as well, you can see that November 2022 was when FTX happened, I think. You can see that obviously quite a lot of liquidations happened, so the stability pool APR jumped up quite a bit as well. And that kind of dictates the APR, and that kind of dictates the yield. And if you look at the last 1 year, it's fixed at 4.11% APR, essentially at the whims of the market, right? So it's very predictable, non-upgradable, trustless, I guess. Cool, so one agency called Blue Chip, who's kind of stablecoin agency, and they're an independent stablecoin agency. What they did recently was they essentially wanted to judge stablecoins and give them a grade, A, B, C, D, depending on 6 factors. Peg stability, like the management of the stablecoin, the implementation, how it's been implemented, if it's upgradable or not, the decentralization aspect of it, the governance aspect of it, and a few other things. And when they did that, essentially Liquidity came out on top as being the most stable and A-grade stablecoin. And one key thing to note is that out of all the decentralized stablecoins, so ignore USDC, USDT for now, Liquidity is essentially the only one that has an A grade. And if you compare it to the likes of DAI and Frax, they both have a lower grade, and it's mainly down to the collateral types that both of these have on offer compared to Liquidity. So a few more slides talking about why people are diversifying into LUSD and Liquidity. So quite a few DAOs have diversified into LUSD. And the main reason is because they essentially want a stablecoin that is resilient, scalable, and also they want something that is trustless and decentralized. So you have, what I'm going to talk about quickly is a few different DAOs who have done that. So you can see a list of them here, but the ones that have done that in the last few months are right here. Let me just see if this, there you go. So you have 3. So you have Dopex, Gearbox, and JPEG. In Dopex's case, they had a $4 million treasury all sitting in USDT. They wanted a stablecoin that was not centralized, was backed by trustless collateral, and also had immutable yield opportunities. So what they did was they did a simple $1 million swap using a DEX aggregator from USDT into LUSD. And their plan is to eventually stake that LUSD within the stability pool within Liquidity. In regards to Gearbox, they had a $3.6 million USDC treasury. They decided to diversify 1.8 million, so half their treasury, into LUSD because they essentially also wanted an immutable, resilient stablecoin, but also they wanted their employees to get paid in LUSD as well. So that's actually a cool use case to see people getting paid in crypto with LUSD. And in JPEG's case, they had a ton of ETH sitting in their treasury. They wanted to be able to borrow against that Ether and deposit that into an immutable yield protocol as well. So in their case, they have $4 million sitting within Liquidity. They're borrowing around $2 million against that, and they have that in the stability pool. So lastly, I'll leave with this. What can you do with LUSD? So other than using it to get yield, you can also use it all across these different ecosystems. So you have multiple chains that LUSD is available on. You have multiple places where you can borrow against your LUSD. And you can also off-ramp and on-ramp LUSD here in Mexico as well using Swarmy. So if you want to off-ramp from LUSD into Mexican pesos, there's a company called Swarmy which offers you that as well. So hopefully the presentation today made you realize the importance of decentralized stablecoins and to consider crypto-native stablecoins. Thank you.